I need to tell you about the night I helped my friend get home safely, knocked on her father's door at 1 in the morning, and watched a man I had never met look at me through the doorway with an expression that was not surprise, not alarm, not the defensiveness a father reasonably earns the right to carry when a stranger shows up with his daughter past midnight. He looked at me the way people look at something they have been expecting for longer than the moment requires. He said, with a quiet certainty that made the porch light feel very bright, "So, it's you." And the problem was, I had absolutely no idea what he meant. But I'm getting there. Before I continue, if you've ever had someone see something in you before you were ready to see it in yourself, leave a like. Because that is exactly what happened to me on a front porch in Minneapolis, and I am still working out what it says about how long I had been looking in the wrong direction. Her name was Nadia Voss. We had been friends for 3 years, the kind of friends who met through overlapping social circles and then kept each other after the circle itself had scattered. She was a graphic designer who worked from home and kept unusual hours and had the specific energy of a person who was always in the middle of 3 projects and somehow always had time for the people she cared about. She was honest in a way that made you trust her immediately and occasionally made you wish she would soften things slightly. She was the first person I called when something genuinely good happened, and the first person I called when something didn't. We were friends. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the story. We were genuinely, completely not performing at friends. There was no unrequited history, no complicated incident, no mutual tension anyone else had noticed. We were 2 people who trusted each other, kept up with each other's lives, and showed up when it counted. That last part is what led to the porch. It was a Friday in March. Nadia had been going through a difficult few months. A long-term relationship had ended in November. Not dramatically, not with shouting or betrayal, but in the particular slow way that hurts differently, because there is nothing to be angry about and nothing to blame, and you are left with only the fact that something you thought would last has simply stopped. She had handled it the way she handled most things, with composure and productivity and very occasional phone calls at 11 at night when the composure got heavy. The Friday in March was a going-away party for a mutual friend named Garrett who was relocating to Denver, a rooftop bar in Uptown, the kind of place that was exactly right for a March night in Minneapolis because the outdoor heaters were aggressive and the view was wide and the inside was warm and crowded enough to feel celebratory without being overwhelming. I had come straight from work. Nadia had arrived earlier and had been there longer. I found her near the bar around 9:30. She was fine when I arrived. She was fine at 10. Somewhere after 10:30, she was less fine, not in a dangerous way, not in the way that requires intervention, but in the specific way of a person who has been holding something heavy for months and has had exactly enough to let it set itself down without permission. By 11, she was leaning against the bar, telling me with complete sincerity that she did not understand why anyone bothered investing in other people, when investment always turned out to be loss. I listened. That was usually the right thing with Nadia. By 11:30, she had moved from investment returns to a general philosophical inquiry into whether hope was a cognitive error. I got her coat. She did not argue about leaving, which told me she had been waiting to be given permission. She told Garrett goodbye with more emotion than she probably intended and followed me toward the stairs without complaint. Outside, the March air was exactly as cold as March in Minneapolis is always cold, which is to say, completely and without apology. Nadia pulled her coat tight and looked at the street with the expression of a person recalibrating. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," I said. "I just said some things that were not particularly optimistic." "You were honest," I said. "There's a difference." She looked at me sideways. "That's a very generous reading. I was being a decent friend. That's all it was." We waited for the car. She leaned against the building with her eyes closed for a moment, not sick, just somewhere between tired and sad in a way that the cold air was helping with. When the car arrived, she got in without difficulty, and I got in beside her and gave the driver her address. She lived in South Minneapolis, a house she had rented for 2 years, A nice neighborhood with big trees and older homes that had good bones and owners who cared about them. A 40-year-old oak in her front yard that she had mentioned once, in passing, as one of the things she would genuinely miss if she ever moved. The drive was mostly quiet. Nadia rested her head against the window. At some point, she said my name. "Yeah," I said. "You are a consistently decent person. You know that? I'm driving you home. It's not a monument." She turned her head slightly toward me. "I mean in general, not just tonight." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which was probably also the right thing. We pulled up to her house at 12:53. The porch light was on, which meant someone was home or someone had left it on for her. The oak tree was large and dark against the sky. The neighborhood was quiet, the way residential streets in Minneapolis go quiet late on a Friday, all the parties either winding down or moved inside. I walked her to the door because she was not catastrophically impaired, but I was not going to sit in a car and watch her navigate a front path in the dark after a night like that one. She found her keys on the second try. She was working on the lock when the door opened from the inside. He was in his early 60s, tall, the kind of tall that does not diminish with age, gray at the temples and fuller gray in the close-cut beard. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and had the look of a man who had been awake for a while without being in distress about it. He took in Nadia first, the way a parent does, running a fast and practiced inventory. "Dad," she said, with the specific resignation of someone who had not expected to be witnessed. "You called from the bar," he said, which explained both the open door and the porch light. Then his eyes moved to me, and there it was. He looked at me for a moment with that expression I described at the beginning, not alarmed, not guarded, not performing the protective assessment a father is entitled to make when a stranger shows up at his door past midnight with his daughter. Something else, something quieter and more specific. He said, "So it's you." 3 words. The kind of sentence that sounds simple until you notice it contains a history you did not know you were part of. I looked at him. He looked at me. Nadia looked between us with the slightly detached confusion of a person whose evening had already asked a lot of her. "Sir," I said, because that was the word available. "My name is Owen. I wanted to make sure she got home safely." He nodded slowly, still with that expression. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." Which was true and also not entirely the reason he said it, but I followed them in. His name was Robert Voss. He had driven up from Duluth that afternoon to spend the weekend, which Nadia apparently had known, and I had not. He made coffee in the kitchen with the efficiency of a man who had been in this kitchen before and knew where things were, and Nadia sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on and her head resting on one hand, moving steadily from the honest, unfiltered version of herself back toward the composed version. I sat across from her because leaving felt wrong, and staying for a few minutes while she steadied herself felt right. Robert set a mug in front of each of us and sat at the end of the table. He wrapped his hands around his own mug and looked at me with the unhurried attention of a man who read people as a habit. Before I ask you what was going through my head at that moment, let me ask you something first. Have you ever sat across from someone's parent and felt, with no rational basis, like you were being recognized rather than assessed, like the person looking at you was not deciding what to think of you, but confirming what they already knew? Leave a comment, because that is what sitting across from Robert Voss at 12:58 in the morning felt like, and I had not been prepared for it. He asked me how I knew Nadia. I told him. 3 years, mutual friends, kept in touch. He asked what I did. I told him that too. Project management, infrastructure consulting, nothing that required a long explanation. He nodded at each answer with the manner of someone collecting information they intended to cross-reference with something they already had. Then he said, without preamble, without particular weight, but with complete intention, "She talks about you." Nadia looked up from her coffee. I kept my face still. "What does she say?" He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who was not going to make this easy or fast, that she has a friend who shows up. He paused. Apparently, that's rarer than it should be. I looked at Nadia. She was looking at the table. Robert continued with the mild, observational tone of someone narrating rather than editorializing. She told me about the time her lease fell through, and she had to be out in 4 days, and you drove over on a Tuesday and helped her move everything into storage. He paused. She told me about when she had the appendectomy last year, and you were the one who drove her to the hospital and waited. I remembered both of those things. I had not thought about them as notable. They were just things that happened when a person needed something, and you were available, and it was not complicated. Dad, Nadia said quietly, with the tone of someone watching something proceed that they are not sure they want to stop. Robert did not redirect. He looked at me. She told me once, he said, about a man who remembered things without being asked. What coffee she took, which conversations she needed to talk through, and which ones she needed to sit with, when to push and when to leave room. He picked up his mug, said she did not know how to explain why she trusted him the way she did. Said it had never been complicated. The kitchen was quiet. The clock above the stove said 1:04. I looked at Nadia. She was looking at me now, with an expression I could not fully read in the kitchen light, except to say it was not the expression of someone who wished their father would stop talking. Sir, I said. Robert. He raised an eyebrow. When you opened the door tonight and said so, it's you. I paused. What did you mean by that? He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, simply, she described you well enough that I would know you. He set his mug down. A father pays attention when his daughter describes someone more than once without calling it what it is. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the quiet street. Nadia stood up from the table. She moved to the counter and stood there with her back to both of us, both hands around her mug, looking at the dark window above the sink. Her shoulders were not tense. She was just being somewhere while the room settled. I looked at Robert. He looked back at me with the patience of a man who had made his point and was now willing to let the rest of it proceed at the pace it needed. I said, I have been her friend for 3 years. He nodded. I said, I have not let myself think about it as anything else. He nodded again. Same expression, still patient. Because I did not want to be wrong about what I thought I understood, I said. He considered that for a moment. Then he said, that is not the worst reason, but it is the kind of reason that becomes a habit. Nadia turned around from the counter. She looked at me with the direct, unguarded expression she used when she was too tired for performance and too honest for polite distance. Owen, she said. Yeah, he's not wrong. 3 words, the quietest thing she had said all night, and also the loudest. I looked at her. She looked at me. Robert looked at neither of us, which was the most generous thing he could have done. I have been here, she said, finally, speaking with the careful precision of a person choosing each word from a larger supply. For 3 years, and you have been here, and I have said your name to my father enough times that he knew your face before he saw it tonight, and I think we both know that is not what friendship alone produces. Her voice did not shake. Nadia's voice rarely shook, but something in it was different from the usual steadiness, not uncertain, just open in a way that cost her something. I stood from the table, not to leave, just because sitting felt like the wrong posture for what the conversation had become. I did not know you talked about me like that, I said. She raised an eyebrow. What way? In a way that would let your father recognize me. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, with the quiet honesty that was her most consistent quality, I talk about most things the way I actually feel about them. I just thought you knew that. I should have, I said. I think I was being careful. She looked up. Of what? Of being wrong. Of changing something that worked. Of asking for more than you were offering. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I have been waiting for you to ask. The kitchen held that sentence for a moment. The clock said 1:11. Robert stood, picked up his mug, and walked to the sink with the unhurried movement of a man who had said what he came to say and was now leaving the room to its rightful occupants. Before he left the kitchen, he looked at me once more. She has good judgment, he said. About most things. I understood what he meant. He walked down the hall toward the guest room, and the door closed behind him with the soft, deliberate sound of a man who was not going to require further involvement. Nadia and I stood in the kitchen in the 1 a.m. quiet and looked at each other the way two people look at each other when the conversation has finally arrived at the place it was always heading, and neither of them has any more reasons to stand in the way. I said, "I did not expect tonight to go like this," she said. "Tonight went the way it needed to go." She almost smiled. "My dad helped. He recognized me from your description," I said. She looked at her coffee. "I may have been thorough." Nadia. She looked up. "Can I take you to dinner?" I said. A real one. Not a favor, not because something went wrong, not because Garrett was moving away. Just you and me, and somewhere quiet, where I can say the things I have been calling something else for 3 years. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the oak tree moved slightly in the wind. Then she said, "Yes. But for the record, I already knew the things you were calling something else." "I know," I said. "That might be the most embarrassing part." She laughed, real and low, the same laugh that arrived without warning and meant she was fully present, and it was the best sound the kitchen had produced all night. We talked for another hour at that table, just the two of us, with the coffee going cold and the house quiet around us. Not about the big things, not yet. About small things that had accumulated over 3 years into something that deserved to be called by its real name. At 2:30, I said goodnight. She walked me to the door. The oak tree was still in the cold, and the porch light was still on, and the street was fully quiet now. She said, "Owen." "Yeah, thank you for bringing me home." "That was the easy part," I said. She shook her head, almost laughing. "You've been doing the hard part for 3 years without knowing it." "Maybe I knew," I said. "I just needed someone to open the door." She looked at me for one more moment in the porch light. "Good thing my dad was here," she said. "Best thing," I said. I walked to my car under the March sky and thought about a man I had never met opening a front door and saying 3 words that turned out to contain 3 years of a story I had been living without reading correctly. Some people see things clearly because they love someone and cannot afford not to. Robert Voss had never met me, but he had heard my name enough times, in enough contexts, with enough consistency that he knew what he was looking at before I walked through the door. That is what it means to be described by someone who feels more than they have said. You show up in the story before you arrive in the room. We had dinner the following Saturday. She was there when I got there. I had already ordered her coffee without sugar. She looked at the cup and then at me. 3 years, she said. 3 years, I said. She picked up the cup and smiled like a woman who had been patient for exactly long enough. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. And if you've ever been seen by someone before you were ready to see yourself, subscribe. The next story is already waiting. If you made it all the way to the end, comment. He knew before the door opened.